Thank you, Madam Chair. So we've tabled two things. One's the presentation, it's only about 10 pages. The other thing is what we call our dashboard report on special housing areas. So that's the full version of the thing you have a sample of in attachment B to this report. So we committed to tabling the entire thing. That gives you quite a bit of detail on what's happening in specific SHAs. And generally all the green blobs indicate activity of one form or another in those SHAs. I don't propose to go through it in detail. It's really for your information and evidence that there's quite a body of information available now subject to further reporting. Last week, tranche 10, the 10th and final tranche of special housing areas was announced by the Mayor and the Minister. That's a picture of it up there. You've got a map of the full list and all the SHAs in attachment A of this report, the quarterly monitoring report. Brings the total to 154, and I should point out that there's an error on the first page of attachment B which refers to 155. It is actually 154. So the purpose of this report is to give you a map of the monitoring and reporting program for the rest of the Housing Accord, and in fact through to December of this year. It talks about three levels of information. One is broadly the information that you'll see in the current or most recent quarterly monitoring report and previous monitoring reports that talks the first part about what's happening across Auckland and what contribution is being made or what progress is being made to the overall Housing Accord target of 39,000 sites or dwellings over 3 years. And any other sort of high level information we were able to provide on SHAs specifically. Level 2 information, which is the subject of that table just circulated, the dashboard report is about SHAs specifically and how things are tracking in SHAs in terms of the time it takes to get through the entire process and the metrics that go with that in terms of various stages of applications for example, plan variations through to all the way through to building consents being granted, and then on to the monitoring of home completions. Level 3 information, which we gather a lot of, and there's something in the order of 800 lines of data in our tables on this. We don't propose to report specifically on consents, but we will report on high-level aggregate data about consents, and that will start to come through in future reports. One of the things that we wanted to I guess re-emphasise in this report was just the scale of activity not only enabled through SHAs but already happening. So this chart shows that half the visible development pipeline, that is developments that we're aware of where developers have intentions, they have the land, they have consents or some way towards those consents. Half of everything that we see of 5 dwellings or more is now in a special housing area. You can see the arrow. This is a cumulative yield graph based on developers' intentions. Information came through the due diligence on SHA establishment processes. We're in 2016, so you can see over 10 years that full yield starts to really become quite substantial. This is a different representation of the same sort of information, which shows how much of that yield we told by developers they're intending to achieve on a year-by-year basis, and you can see that if this is based on dwelling consents, we wouldn't expect the consenting activity in SHAs to peak until year 17 or 18. This assumes, of course, that the consenting will carry on under the adopted unitary plan rather than under HASHA. This is a composite of a couple of images from the monitoring report and attachment A to your report. It just shows that across Auckland overall, there's still a very quite deliberate, or not deliberate, but sort of clear trend upwards. There's a line that's sort of heading up, and we expect it to carry on up for some time. The next monitoring report, I think, will show that we've in terms of year on year, we've got over that 10,000 mark, which is quite a milestone, and heading towards that previous peak of around 12 or 13,000 that was achieved in 2002, some time back. In terms of the Housing Accord target of 39,000 sites and dwellings, I think the composite 3-year target is, we're still more or less on track for that. We have some fat and reserve from the first year. It may be more challenging to hit the 17,000 third year, but over the 3-year target, put it all together, we're still more or less on track. The top left box here talks about a total of 42 SHAs where there is current construction activity. And the purpose of attachment C in this report and some information that was presented at the release last week was to try and show visually examples of this activity, and this report puts that in context in terms of okay, certainly a lot of activity, but what does it represent in terms of the full yield potential from SHAs? And there's some facts on the first page of the report about that, but let's just give one example of that. So all of the images essentially represent activity in 12 SHAs of the 42 where there's current construction activity. In terms of the land supply pipeline enabled through SHAs, that represents something like 11% of that land supply, which is something like 2.75% of the total land supply enabled by the future urban zone in the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan. So it's just the tip, really, of the iceberg. And roughly the construction of dwellings in those photos represents something like 2% of the 56,000 that will be enabled through SHAs. So, Madam Chair, I might just leave the presentation there and take questions.
Great, thank you. Right, questions? Councillor Casey.
David, could you just talk me through this? Say if you went to Tranche 3 Oru-Rangi Road, could you just talk me through that top line? Because there's a lot of abbreviations, I just want to understand it. So talk me through the top line.
Okay, I might invite my colleague Robert Bates to respond to you. He's the compiler of this information.
Through you, Madam Chair, the spreadsheet contains, as David said, it's our primary level 2 information. It's SHA by SHA information, so there are now 154 rows of information here. The first columns really indicate the establishment of the SHA. Its tranche, its request date, its gazette date, and then the time elapsed, the time that it took us to process it from request to gazetting. Then there's details about the SHA, its number, its name, area type, greenfield or brownfield for our monitoring work. And then we can sort, the next few columns allow us to sort it by board, by ward, and various other by zoning status. In other words, picking up future urban zone and the like. But usefully, the board and ward columns allow us to, on request, we could just filter out for a local board and just give them their SHAs of interest to them, or a ward councillor could be given areas of interest to them. So that's just really a filtering mechanism. Moving across, we have the yield, the estimated dwelling yield, and that's at gazetting, and that often changes over time. When we get the first qualifying development, it will pre-apps in. They do vary over time. That is its gazetted yield. Then details about gross area and net area, that helps us monitor how much of the future urban zone hectarage we're using. And then the green, the next columns really allow us to track what's happening in that SHA from pre-application lodged right through to qualifying development approved. Where you see effectively a clear line, either the developer is doing it outside of HASHA or nothing's happening at all. So you'll see a number of tranche 10, for example, midway down the page. You'll see the tranche 10 ones, of course, absolutely clear, nothing happening in those because they've yet to be gazetted. But we would expect within a month or so to start to see green appear on the page in some of those. Most of the activity, most of the SHOs, as you can see on the various pages, have activity happening up to approval stage. The last few yellow columns, current yield in lots, current yield in dwellings, and consented dwellings. We keep a track of those. So once it's left the DPO's office, we go out and we check on numbers of dwellings completed. We check on sites surveyed through section 224 and so on. At the moment, the estimate of completed dwellings, we do have estimates, but we're just finishing off some new methodology, which literally yesterday or the day before spitting out some new numbers automatically. Previously, it's been done manually to get those numbers, and we're now getting some good results, and so that column needs to be repopulated. And finally, the activity status at the end, it helps us with one of those pie charts that David showed you a moment ago. It really gives us an overall picture of whether the SHA in the dark green is still being, still in the hands of the developer doing the early designs, right through to the pale colour where we're actually seeing homes built. There are some other pieces of information on the end. We have developer's name and various things which we didn't put into here today. There's quite a lot of other information, infrastructure issues. We're looking at a flagging system to be able to flag SHOs that are going more slowly than they should be, and those that are going well. So that's the chart.
So a couple of questions based on that. What prompts a site visit, and who does the site visit? That last question, that last column, dwelling construction status.
They're done by the DPO. We've got monitoring officers, of course, who go out and make sure that stormwater ponds, for example, roading is being done according to consent. But also the monitoring team, David's team, we also go out regularly to look at progress just on this for more high-level statistical purposes. But between that, with the monitoring team and ourselves, we try and keep a pretty good track of what's going on in each of the SHOs. As I say, the data will become automated for a number of those now, so we don't have to, for say Trent Street, before someone has to look at it, actually go on the ground, we'll see the data coming through when they start putting houses on Trent Street. It should be somewhat more automated than having to go out to a site the whole time.
And just one, what does LUCQDS approved mean?
Land use consent qualifying development for a land use consent. Yeah.
Land use consent.
There's 3 columns there relating to PVs, which are planned variations. Those relate only to future urban zone land that requires to go through a planned variation process to create live zones. So what we generally refer to as brownfield sites don't need to go through those steps.
It's very clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Casey, and I think, yep, got you, Mr Mayor. I think that our Robert and the team need to be congratulated. It seems a very long time since I drew on the whiteboard what I was hoping we would get laid out in clear, unequivocal fashion, and I thank you very much for doing what I asked for, and it's exceedingly useful. Thank you. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Look, there's been media reports, David, that there's only been 700 dwellings built, but it seems to be a much more, the picture actually seems to be a lot rosier than that in terms of consents approved, developer building houses all the way down throughout that, and earthworks continuing and so forth. So can you give us a sense then of, with that continuing work, what the yield will be in terms of dwellings, not sections, but in terms of dwellings over the next 12 months or so?
Do you want to take it?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. Our estimates at December, the end of December, were for 700 dwellings. That was based largely on site inspections and on what developers were telling us. We have, frequently discussed with them. We know what they're delivering when the houses are completed. As I've said, we are trying to automate the system now. So consent granted, as soon as it's final inspection or code compliance certificate comes in, we would count 1 for a single dwelling, and if it's a block of apartments, we would count, say, 10. And that